Thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's really a wonderful honor to be here to introduce to all of you Nancy MacLean, who is one of the most acclaimed historians working in the United States today. Today we're more than a year into the presidency of Donald Trump. I know what to do. And many of us didn't see that coming. But we're also into the second week of a public school teacher strike in West Virginia. And many of us didn't see that coming, and the strike just ended because they won. I know. 33,000 teachers making minimum, but not much more than $30,000 a year. They beat a Republican governor. They beat a Republican Congress, state Congress. To give you a sense of their achievement, there's about 15 million union jobs in the United States, a couple of thousand unions. I can't really see you, but maybe you could just yell out the answer. Does anybody have a sense of how many strikes there were last year? Of what? 7, that's right. All right. That didn't, I was hoping I'd be more dramatic, but yes, 7. Yes, seven industrial strikes, the lowest number on record. And in West Virginia, these teachers were striking in a deep red state. Many of them were no doubt Trump supporters, voters. They defied the law. It's illegal for them to strike. They aren't even technically a union. They're an association. Public workers can't strike. But they defied their own leadership, wanted to cut an earlier deal for a lower raise, and they stayed out and they won. They weren't 5% for themselves, 5% for public workers across the board, but much more than a raise. They fought back against a vision of society that imagines no place for their kind of collective solidarity. They fought back and won against charter schools, against laws trying to hobble their unions by collecting dues, against cuts to health care. It really was a remarkable movement, and it seemed to come out of nowhere, right? Many of the strikers began to wear red bandanas in tribute to the 1921 Battle of Blair Mountain, coal miners' insurgency against the company and against the state police. And so it's, these are the people that Republicans want to give guns to, right? The teachers. So let's see, how that works out. And now there's reports that teacher unions in Oklahoma and Arizona are beginning to organize. So these are no doubt about it. These are dark days, right? Dark days. But there's a sense that something's happening. The students in Florida organizing against the NRA. There's teachers in West Virginia. There's an effort to return to what was once lost, a rejection of a society that reduces the common weal, the general good, to the pursuit of individual self-interests, right? A rejection of the notion that the whole point of community and society is compound interest forever, right? That individuals are more than profit-making unions, and corporations are something a little bit less than creatures that can claim human rights, including the right to free speech. So it's all of this is just a way of saying it brings us to the reason why we're in the beautiful Lenzig Theater, and that's to hear an historian that can kind of explain the current moment like no other, Nancy MacLean, and I'm very happy to be able to introduce her. She's one of the country's most respected historians. She teaches at my old university. I taught at Duke for a few years. She's the William H. Chafe Professor of History and Public Policy. She's the recipient of multiple awards and prizes, teacher prizes. She's published widely. Her first 2 books also are timely. First book is the book on the Behind the Mask of Chivalry, the making of the second KKK, second Ku Klux Klan. I guess we're now in the third and fourth and fifth edition of that. But and the book that she followed was Freedom is Not Enough, trying to bring the promise of equality that was advanced by the civil rights movement into the workplace through unions and try to equalize relations of gender and relations of race. Trying to these activists who trying to make good on FDR's famous saying that that needy men, necessitous men, are not free. People are not free. That you need to live a life of dignity. That citizenship entails some degree of social rights. So those two books alone would credential her for being able to speak on the current moment, but it's really her new book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America, that brings her here today. That book really does this new book really does do what all good history books should do. It comforts the afflicted and it afflicts the comfortable. You've hit a nerve. You've hit a nerve when the whole Koch machine begins to crank up, to push back on its arguments, even before the book was officially published, I think. Nancy's book, it's richly detailed with many component parts, but within a day of its publication, a number of economists who are shamelessly embedded in exactly the networks that Nancy is writing about, the Koch-funded networks that Nancy is writing about and revealing, went on the offensive to trash it, to discredit it. They failed. The book's been widely hailed. It was nominated for a National Book Award. It's been celebrated, and I think its main arguments are getting out. Two arguments in particular, the book that I just want to touch on, that I think give a sense of why those allied with the Koch brothers' vision of what democracy should look like reacted so strongly to the book. First is the argument that the cult of individual supremacy that they expound, the idea that individuals and the common good and the common weal could just be reduced to market relations. I think of that as a cult of individual supremacy, that it's fundamentally has its roots in white supremacy, and you can't extricate it. There's no way of delinking it. And one of the great things about Nancy's book is showing the ways that is true. How much of the new right libertarian reaction was a reaction to Brown v. the Board of Education, the ruling to desegregate the public schools in the 1950s. And the second argument that she makes that riled those people is that nobody wants to live in the world that they want, right? The radical free market, in which all public good and public policy is defined by supply and demand, it's profoundly unpopular. Nobody wants to live in that savage nirvana. Nobody wants to, so deceit, either deceit or repression are necessary to bring that world about. And I work primarily, I do a lot of work on Latin America, and the repression part was certainly true in Latin America, but the repression part here in terms of voter suppression and the deceit in terms of how it's sold is people want clean air, they want a good education, they want health care, they want government on their side in an age of corporate monopoly power. And so a lot of the movement that Nancy is writing about is aimed at containing those demands and channeling them somewhere else. So I'll just end here and bring Nancy out in a second. It really is a rare book. I just want to say one other thing. Democracy in Chains, it's a rare book that's able to narrate ideas as drama. Able to capture kind of sweeping moral changes and conflict that's at stake. How it is, for instance, that corporations have come to be considered the bearers of human rights. But Nancy's a rare historian that does it in a really remarkable way. And I'll leave her to tell you about a book, but I don't think there's any, we're living in a time in which words have become disassociated from meaning, right? Corporations have rights, money is speech, guns is liberty. And the word choice, it's amazing how that word choice, and Nancy will talk to you about public choice theory. I mean, has there ever been such a more benign sounding word that has put to more hideous ends, to dismantle the very notion of the common weal? So with that, let me just introduce you Nancy now, and I'm looking forward to coming out and speaking with her after her remarks. So with that, let me give you Nancy MacLean.
Wow. I like Santa Fe. Wow. I am so delighted to be here with you, and I am especially delighted because I can tell you're an amazing audience. I have not heard an audience like this in some time, and it's really a thrill to be with you. I am also pleased to be here because I happened to take a walk today, and I noticed that the Lensic Theater has me sharing the marquee with Katie Lang. So I just think this is an absolutely sublime city, and it is so good to be with you all. And thank you for coming out tonight. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you and with Greg. I'm also deeply, deeply honored to have been awarded the 2017 Lannan Foundation Cultural Freedom Award, and to be sharing the stage with my fellow historian, Greg Grandin. I've admired Greg's work for so long, and this is actually the first time I've had the chance to meet him. So I'm really delighted with that and really appreciate his generous introduction. And I also want to give a thank you to the Lannan family and to Sarah Knopp and to Barbara Ventrella for being such good hosts, and also to all of you for your commitment to cultural freedom, to a cultural freedom that allows us to speak the truth to the powerful still, whether they like it or not. So I want to thank you. I'd like to start with a brief reading from the opening of my book that will take us back to another time, to a small college town that has been in the news again this past year, to suggest how our perplexing present moment may appear in an altered light when we see where it has come from. And that's a theme that I'll develop more in my talk, but I thought I would begin with this so you would have a sense of the research and the story. As 1956 drew to a close, Colgate Whitehead Darden Jr., the president of the University of Virginia, feared for the future of his beloved state. The previous year, the U.S. Supreme Court had issued its second Brown versus Board of Education ruling, calling for the dismantling of segregation in public schools with all deliberate speed. In Virginia, outraged state officials responded with legislation to force the closure of any local school that planned to comply, a pattern, by the way, that's today being called preemption and spreading. Some extremists called for ending public education entirely. Darden, who earlier in his career had been the governor, could barely stand to contemplate the damage such a rash move would inflict. Even the name of this plan, massive resistance, made his gentlemanly Virginia sound like Mississippi. On his desk was a proposal written by the man he had recently appointed chair of the economics department at UVA. 37-year-old James McGill Buchanan liked to call himself a Tennessee country boy, but Darden knew better. No less a figure than Milton Friedman had extolled Buchanan's potential. As Darden reviewed the document, he might have wondered if the newly hired economist had read his mind. For without mentioning the crisis at hand, Buchanan's proposal put in writing what Darden was thinking. Virginia needed to find a better way to deal with the incursion on states' rights represented by Brown. James Buchanan was not a member of the Virginia elite, nor is there any explicit evidence to suggest that for a conservative white Southerner of his day, he was uniquely racist or insensitive to the concept of equal treatment. And yet somehow all he saw in the Brown decision was coercion. Find the resources, he proposed to Darden, for me to create a new center on the campus of the University of Virginia, and I will use this center to create a new school of political economy and social philosophy. It would be an academic center, rigorously so, but one with a quiet political agenda to defeat what he called the perverted form of liberalism that sought to destroy their way of life, a social order, as he described it, built on individual liberty, a term with its own coded meaning in the South that Darden understood. The center, Buchanan promised, would train a new line of thinkers in how to argue against those seeking to impose what he called an increasing role of government in economic and social life. He could win this war, and he would do it with ideas. Some may argue that while Darden fulfilled his part, he found the money to establish the center, he never got much in return. Buchanan's team had no discernible success in decreasing the federal government's pressure on the South all the way through the 1960s and 70s. But take a longer view. Follow the story forward into the second decade of the 20th century, and a different picture emerges, one that is both testament to Buchanan's intellectual powers and at the same time, the utterly chilling story of the ideological origins of the single most powerful and least understood threat to democracy today, the attempt by the billionaire-backed radical right to undo democratic governance. Over the past few years, it has become ever more obvious that American politics are in crisis, in Washington and now in a majority of the states. The nation's government goes from crisis to crisis. Does anyone think Congress is functioning normally? Federal departments and agencies? The courts shaped by the new president's judicial appointments? No. Even elementary norms of truth-telling and decency are in deep crisis. You know this, and I think that's why you're here tonight. But what you might be struggling to figure out is how we got here and what that means. The watershed that we've reached in our public life in the United States has been fed by many streams, of course. They include the kind of movement conservatism that made Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate for president in 1964, just after his vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, building on the popularity he developed from opposing Brown versus Board of Education. Another and related stream is the religious right. And there is the white supremacist right that has resurfaced with a vengeance of late. All of these are important, and each of them has yielded votes to effect radical policy change. But I'm here tonight to talk to you about another piece of the puzzle of how we got into the dangerous situation in which we now find ourselves. A little-known missing piece that explains much that otherwise remains mysterious. And that is the ideas that are guiding the billionaire-funded libertarian right made notorious by Charles Koch. And I believe knowing about these ideas and where they came from and how Koch's operations have weaponized them is important not just in its own right, to see more clearly, to see exactly what is happening and why and how in our public life right now, but also I think it's important because having that knowledge may equip concerned people like yourselves, and I could tell that from your responses earlier on, may equip you to lead the way out of this mess before it's too late. A public health nurse who read the book and wrote to me used this analogy. She said, "You need to get the diagnosis right before you can determine the best treatment plan." So why does getting the diagnosis right matter so much? Because there's an unmarked hazard in our situation in America right now, and that is that the noisiest threats are getting the most attention. Among them, the now chronic race baiting and bullying coming from the White House. But as the man I've come to think about as the distractor-in-chief draws nearly all of our public attention, an even more extreme plan is moving along apace. In the 30 states now totally dominated by this cause, to the extent that the Democracy Alliance describes them as having an electoral stranglehold over these states, in federal departments and agencies, and in the courts. This plan is being pursued by a much smaller cause, but one that is archly determined and breathtakingly well-funded. And this cause's architects aim to rewrite the rules of our society permanently. I'll state my case simply. Behind all the seeming chaos and dysfunction in our public life right now, there is a strategy in play, a cold-eyed, calculated strategy. And that strategy is far along. One of its field generals said this in late 2015, and I quote, "We're close to winning. They," he was referring to the critics, but you could say the rest of the citizenry, "they don't have the real path. They don't have the real path." That was Mark Holden, the head of Koch Industries' government and public affairs operation, gloating to an invitation-only audience of billionaire and multimillionaire donors. Now, you've all heard, and I'm sure read, a great deal in the last several years about the fortune that Charles Koch has been investing in our political system. But what you have likely not heard about is the ideas, the technology, as Koch refers to them. And this is a man with 3 engineering degrees from MIT, who I think has been vastly underestimated by some of his critics. The ideas that have lately made those investments so devastatingly effective where they were not before. And in fact, Koch just recently gloated to the latest donor summit that he has made more progress in the last 5 years than he had been able to make in 50 years before that. The reason for that, I believe, is the ideas that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And I learned through the course of my research that it was an academic economist who taught Charles Koch that for capitalism to thrive, democracy must be enchained. Not overthrown in an obvious way, but rather rigged to the point that it can no longer provide what citizens have looked to it to provide since the 1890s. From things like retirement security to environmental protection to workplace health and safety, anti-discrimination, and all the rest. So my research provides the backstory of this defining moment in which we find ourselves, as it also exposes that real path to which Mark Holden referred. In its essence, the book is the story of 2 men, a thinker and a CEO, whose lives converged beginning in the 1970s through their shared commitment to transform the model of government that our country built up over the 20th century in response particularly to collective citizen pressure of different kinds. The thinker was, as I said earlier, the Tennessee-born economist James McGill Buchanan, who ironically spent most of his career in Virginia public higher education institutions, and the CEO is, of course, the Kansas-backed Koch, who spent most of his adult life, when he wasn't making Koch Industries into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, a multinational operating in 60 countries at this point, I believe is the count, spent most of his adult life, by his own description, obsessively seeking a way to make our country conform to his arch vision of economic liberty, a kind of free-rein capitalism that would be beyond the reach of voters and our governments. So the history my book conveys is first of the crucible in which Buchanan came up with this idea of enchaining democracy to insulate economic liberty, and that was as the civil rights movement made headway in Virginia, on his own campus in Charlottesville, and in the nation in the late 1950s and 60s. And then it is a story of why and how Charles Koch funded an apparatus to make that idea of enchaining democracy a reality in a messianic quest that has produced the volatile situation we are now confronting. What I'd like to do with the remainder of my time is share with you the story of how I stumbled on the trail that led me to these conclusions. Because as you hear it, for one thing, you'll see that there was a lot of stumbling and a lot of coincidence to putting this together. But I also think that knowing the route that led me to those rather stark claims that I've just made will also give you a sharper sense of the stakes. Because it turns out, for one thing, that what we're seeing now, what we have seen since 2016, is not the first time the libertarian right has shown itself willing to exploit white supremacy to advance a cause that I have come to think about as property supremacy. A property supremacy that will devastate people of color and lesser income most profoundly, but will ultimately affect us all, including our planet. So what led me to conclude this? In a word, serendipity. I am a historian of social movements in the United States with a particular interest in the South. And about 10 years ago, I just finished one book. By the way, I'd never heard of James Buchanan at that time, so don't feel bad if you haven't. Nor had I heard of Charles Koch. Nobody really had if they weren't in the fossil fuel industry or the libertarian movement. This was in 2006, and I went into the American Friends Service Committee archives in Philadelphia and came across firsthand documentation of this incredibly tragic history in Prince Edward County, Virginia, where white officials answered the U.S. Supreme Court's call to desegregate its public schools without further delay by, as these white officials put it, and I quote, going out of the public school business entirely. They shuttered the entire public school system in this county. They even posted no trespassing signs on the schools, and they left black children with no formal education whatsoever as the county's white children headed off to a subsidized private segregation academy, and the county officials kept the public schools shut in Virginia, in Southside Virginia, in Prince Edward, for 5 years until the courts compelled them to reinstate a public school system. I was shocked that as a historian of social movements who had done much work on the South, I had never come across this story before, and I was really moved by what I was seeing in these sources, and so I started to research this, and very quickly found that tax-funded school vouchers were crucial to this story. They were the pivot of Virginia's massive resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, and that Virginia had evangelized across the South for such tax-funded school vouchers. And I also learned in fairly short order that the Chicago free market economist Milton Friedman had issued his first manifesto for vouchers like this in 1955, in the full knowledge of how that manifesto would be used by segregationist officials in the South. And I know that because I found the correspondence between him and a liberal economist editor who challenged him and asked all the kinds of questions that you and I would have asked of such a thing in that time and place. So Friedman became part of my story, and it was clear that there was a new history of neoliberalism here that we had not heard before and that I believed we needed to understand to see what was happening in our public life now. But in following a footnote on this story as I was seeing it develop, I learned of a 1959 report as this Prince Edward County threat was in the air because they were going to close the schools in September of 1959. By two other economists, both of them trained at the University of Chicago, who had recently set up a center at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, one of them, as I described, James McGill Buchanan. The two economists' report attempted to refute the moderate whites led by mothers and liberal clergy who were trying to save Virginia's school system. They were trying to save it because the school system was under such threat by the opponents of the Brown decision that another element of the massive resistance legislation in Virginia required the governor to shut down any school in the state that planned to comply with the Brown decision, to overrule the local authorities in this pattern we've come to know as preemption today. And so that fall in 1958, they shut down schools in 3 Virginia communities, Charlottesville, Norfolk, where there was a big U.S. naval base, and Front Royal, a textile town. And they locked out 13,000 white children through the fall of 1958 because white schools were the ones that were being sued to open up to all students. So it was in this context that this massive parents' movement developed. And its case was that Virginia couldn't afford two systems of education, that this private school system would undermine the already beggared public school system, so they shouldn't be using these vouchers. So the economists, what they tried to do was say that the moderates had it wrong. The moderates weren't doing the math right, because the moderates didn't factor in that if the state sold off all of its tax-funded resources, its school buildings and their contents, then they would be able to give those to private operators who could provide better education without obeying the courts. And they used, of course, all the rhetoric we've come to hear today, like the choice, anti-monopoly, competition, and so forth and so on. But so basically, their report called for privatizing public schools before that verb was even part of our national vocabulary. And they did this in the full knowledge that the schools funded in this way would be white segregation academies, because those were the only private schools in question. Black parents and their organizations opposed these vouchers to a person in Virginia, seeing them as an insult to the constitutional dignity that had just been recognized with the Brown decision. So needless to say, as a university professor myself, it stunned me to see two faculty members making a case for what their state's most arch segregationists were seeking. And it intrigued me that they did so not in racist terms, but in economic terms, consciously leveraging the authority of their discipline and Buchanan's status as the chair of the economics department in the state's flagship university to back up what the most right-wing anti-democratic figures of the day were seeking. Buchanan and his colleague knew they were exploiting the rage of white supremacists to move their libertarian economic agenda, an agenda they referred to as the free society, even as they showed no sympathy for the civil rights activists, even on their own campus, whose mantra was freedom now. Their cover letter to the state legislators actually said they were issuing this report, and I quote, letting the chips fall where they may. Letting the chips fall where they may. And as a social historian who had watched what was happening in Virginia in these years, it was pretty obvious to me, as it was to them and anybody else, where those chips would fall, and that these two professors were conscious and fully aware of the harm that their actions would inflict. And again, as an educator myself, I wondered how anyone could do such a thing. Not in an irrational frenzy, the kind of thing that many Northerners think of when they imagine Southern anti-Brown activists in these years. Not in irrational frenzy, but in cold-eyed calculation. So my curiosity piqued. I began to seek more information about this Buchanan. And I learned that he had won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1986. He was awarded the prize for having pioneered a new way of thinking called public choice economics, which I learned had also become influential in political science and the legal academy, and also among activists and elected officials on the right. What Buchanan did that was new, in his phrase, was the economic analysis of politics. But of course, there have been other forms of economic analysis of politics in the last few centuries. And what Buchanan was doing was actually quite distinctive and different from those other forms. What he did was apply Chicago-style libertarian economics to political actors to argue that they could only be understood as individuals rationally seeking their own personal self-interest. Not the common good, as they claimed, in the case of labor people, not the working class, in the case of civil rights activists, not the race. No, individuals seeking their own personal self-interest. So this set of assumptions led Buchanan, and by the way, I should say this is all theoretical, not empirical with Buchanan, all done through elaborate game theory and so forth. But this led him to a new explanation of deficits, of deficit spending, because he made sense of why governments, democratic governments, would overspend in times of prosperity, not just times of depression and recession. And as a thinker who identified with the political right in the South and nationally, he made his mission finding ways to lower taxes and to shrink the expanding public sector of his time. With this public choice economics, he turned new attention to what he liked to call the rules of the game of politics, to the spending incentives of the political process and how altering the rules of that process could yield different outcomes. And I want to be clear here and say that there are some people who have been attracted to or seen value in public choice ideas who are not on the political right. Cass Sunstein is an example of that at Harvard Law School. He wrote a book called Nudge, thinking about how adjusting incentives could do things like improve public health. So there's a broader school here, and it is not all associated with the right. But as I went along and learned more about all this, I also found that Buchanan's version, what came to be known as the Virginia School of Political Economy, to distinguish it from the Chicago School, was always distinctive. And Buchanan himself said, looking back in a documentary done in 2007, that when he set to work in the late 1950s, the idea of the public interest was dominant. The idea of the common good, the idea that people in public life actually cared about what was best for the majority of society. And he said, that's what I wanted to tear down. That's what I wanted to tear down. The hypocrisy of politicians speaking of the public interest. So here again, I'm a newcomer to this strange land of libertarianism, and why, I thought, would anyone want to do that? I mean, we all know the public interest isn't a set thing, right? It's something that, you persuade people, you might organize a movement, you do all these things. If you persuade a majority, then we say it represents the public interest and the common good, and you go and do things like clean up your air and water supply or stop discrimination in workplaces or whatever. But he was saying that the very idea of the public interest was a fraud. So, go figure. But as I read more, I learned that to a libertarian like Buchanan, there is no common good. Any such notion of shared purpose, they believe, will lead government to coerce those who don't agree with the majority. And Buchanan and his colleagues came to argue that democracy systematically violates the individual liberty of the minority. And I have to say, I spent quite some time going through this man. He has 20 volumes of collected works. He had some 60 years of personal papers. And the only minority I ever found him being concerned with was that of the wealthiest taxpayers who didn't share the majority's view of the public interest. And government, Buchanan and his colleagues argued, all but steals the property of such people if it taxes them for purposes that they don't share. So he was really at pains to argue that we should not be our brother's keepers. And in fact, he wrote a very influential article called The Samaritan's Dilemma that basically said Jesus was wrong. It just wasn't applicable in modern times. You shouldn't try to help someone in need because that would lead them to exploit you. But anyway, the idea is that any notion of shared purpose will lead government to coerce those who don't agree. And he came to talk about all of this in very stark and foreboding terms that are now quite widespread on the right, owing to decades of promulgation by Buchanan's teams and the many think tanks with which they worked. So I'll give you a case in point. I can't actually see you if you raise your hands, but I sort of can. How many remember when Mitt Romney said at a $50,000 a plate dinner that 47% of the population would never vote for him because they were too dependent on government? Okay, I'm seeing many hands. And lots of people thought that that shocking remark cost Romney the election. But what we didn't know then is that Romney was not speaking for himself in saying that. He was sharing ideas that were widespread on the right that came from this public choice economics. And at the time that Romney said that, in fact, the Heritage Foundation, with which Buchanan worked and which Koch funds, the Heritage Foundation was keeping what they called an annual index of dependency derived from public choice economics to measure the degree to which they think the rest of us are too dependent on one another through government. But it was Buchanan, above all, especially through that Nobel Prize, who gave scholarly imprimatur to such thinking. And he did not hold back. He spoke, and this isn't scholarly work, he spoke of net tax recipients as, and I quote, parasites on the productive. He also warned of predators and prey. The predators being, say, senior citizens who would try to get a prescription drug benefit with Medicare, or public teachers like those ones in Virginia who want to be able to support their families and maybe teach a class of students that doesn't go over 40 students, et cetera. All those people were parasites, predators, and the prey were these wealthier taxpayers who didn't want to do these things. His very vocabulary made fellow citizens appear as menaces from the animal world, not even truly human. Think about it, parasites, predators. It's a vocabulary that is disinhibiting, it is a vocabulary that licenses hostility, and it is a vocabulary that is animating the American right today, including the alt-right, where it is most visible. As I read more, I learned also that for those who think this way, justice is a simple matter. As one of Buchanan's colleagues has put it on the Conservative Political Action Conference circuit, he says, I'll give you my definition of social justice. I keep what I earn, you keep what you earn. But Buchanan didn't stop there. Believing this way, he moved in the 1970s from scholarship to organizing, to urging right-wing donors and allied electoral officials like Edwin Meese, who was then Governor Ronald Reagan's leading advisor, to build up what Buchanan described as a counterintelligentsia. And Buchanan urged that the way to do this was to create what he called a gravy train. A gravy train that would bring, again in his terms, men into the libertarian fold and train them for this kind of intellectual battle. And as he organized, he also shifted from analysis to prescription, to what he called constitutional economics, in the belief that all existing constitutions in the world were failures as far as protecting the wealthy from the majority was concerned, and he said this on more than one occasion. He set out to design a legal regime, excuse me, that could protect capitalism from government, that could enshrine the rights of the wealthy minority to a degree that no society anywhere had ever done. And he turned to this challenge at a particularly propitious moment in the mid-1970s when the military junta of General Augusto Pinochet in Chile was facing intense international pressure to return to representative government, yet wanted to keep in place the radical changes that they had made in Chilean society and government, while the population was unable to exercise any power. So they wanted to figure out how to devise a constitution that would enable them to, say, keep the Social Security privatization they had done that had all Chileans investing their holdings with Chile's financial sector, which was just about as responsible as America's, and so many people lost their life savings. Anyway, I could go on. They wanted to lock all that in. And so they invited Buchanan to Chile, to Santiago in 1980 to try out these ideas for how to devise a constitution that would protect capitalism from government. That constitution, it's called the Constitution of Liberty, is still in effect today. And in 2013, Michelle Bachelet, a president who was elected by 2/3 of the Chilean people on a wide-ranging reform program driven by young people who were out in the streets in the tens of thousands to protest against the impact of privatization of the schools there, she got into office and she realized that what she called the authoritarian trammels of this Constitution were keeping her from delivering on what that supermajority of the Chilean people wanted. And she said, Chile needs a constitution without locks and bolts. But those locks and bolts were exactly what Buchanan was brought in to advise on the creation of. And I am sad to have to tell you that this story is not a detour of purely historical interest. This kind of constitution, a constitution of locks and bolts, is now coming to America, thanks to pressure from the Koch donor network and its allies in all the wide-ranging organizations it funds and the legislative allies that it has developed in a Republican Party that has turned into a delivery vehicle for its agenda. They are pushing for a constitution of locks and bolts, particularly the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, that I'm sure you've heard a lot about. And they have been pushing for this so effectively, also while we've been watching the distractor-in-chief with his tweets over here, keeping us from looking where we should be. They now have 28 of the 34 states needed to call a convention, a constitutional convention. Just to be clear about this, not since that document was crafted in 1787 has there ever been a state-called constitutional convention. That's how radical this is, and it's perhaps a year or two away at the rate things are going. Now, and by the way, I did an op-ed about this. It's happened since the book came out, but I believe that the $1.5 trillion addition to the deficit that December's tax bill will create by all reasonable calculations, that deficit will be used to push for the Constitutional Convention with a balanced budget amendment as the loss leader, like a grocery store sale to get people in. Okay. You might be wondering how I was able to put together the way that Buchanan's ideas are guiding the real path that the Koch network is following to shackle democracy. And the answer is, again, coincidence. I moved to North Carolina in 2010. I was still thinking about this as a school story centering Friedman, but I'd gotten more interested in this Buchanan guy. I knew his school had played a bigger role in Chile than Friedman's Chicago school, but there was very little written about it. Still trying to figure that out. And I moved to this state that was once the most moderate, some would say progressive state in the South, just as a radicalized Republican Party dominated by Koch-backed Tea Party figures won majorities in both houses of the state legislature. And suddenly, the things I was reading about in Buchanan's work that still seemed so abstract became concrete as the General Assembly's lead donor boasted of the Big Bang his grantees were developing and of how they were turning this once moderate state into what he again boasted was a laboratory for the cause, using measures from this public choice school of thought. So what did I see happening in this shock and awe style Big Bang in North Carolina? Buchanan had long urged the other scholars he worked with, the right-wing think tanks that he advised, the businessmen he brought to his centers and such. He had said, if you don't like the outcome of public policy over the long term, as we could say libertarians didn't like the whole 20th century, if you don't like the outcome of policy over the long term, stop thinking about who rules. Forget about the particular individuals. Don't even pay attention to the parties. Instead, study the rules. The rules is where the action are. So he explained to like thinkers and to those who funded them, including Charles Koch, that if you wanted to get the kind of radical transformation that libertarians did, you had to start focusing laser-like on systematically changing the rules of governance. We could say, as Chile had, but Buchanan and his team faced the much bigger challenge of pulling this kind of radical rules change off legally in a democracy where the opposition could organize. What I watched unfold in North Carolina after 2010 was a stunning barrage of radical rules change on this model. It was like shock and awe warfare, one after another. I can't even go into them all. They run onto several pages, but I'll just give you some that really stick out. First of all, the most radical and precise and sophisticated gerrymandering we have ever seen in this country to misrepresent the will of the electorate, so that those Republican elected officials could choose their voters instead of the voters choosing who would represent them. New measures to undermine workers' ability to organize in unions, particularly public sector unions. Attacks on public education at all levels and radical cuts in funding for it. Repeal of a very hard-won Racial Justice Act that was designed to ensure fairness in policing and the criminal justice system. Refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act, despite a crying need for it in our low-wage state. Rolling back measures to protect the environment and reduce global warming. And also, in all of these things, breaking with customary governing practices like public hearings before passing legislation and transparency about the process. Instead, what we saw is actors operating with breakneck speed and frequently with secrecy. And then, to cap it all off, they passed what came to be known as the monster voter suppression bill, which in some 15 different ways tried to keep people from the polls who would object to this agenda. And what proved so surreal to me, both as a scholar and as a citizen, was that I could see that this new Republican majority was applying Buchanan's ideas to get what they otherwise could not, what they certainly could not have gotten if they campaigned openly for the measures, the kinds of policies and measures they were pushing through. But also, kind of eerily unsettling, was watching how the critics of all of this, good, well-intentioned people who were shocked at the U-turn their beloved state was taking, were missing the deep operational strategy that unified these varied measures. People couldn't see that the men who were pushing this agenda were not misinformed about the likely consequences of the agenda they were setting in stone. They fully understood that it would inflict grievous harm on many of their fellow citizens. They knew, as the reports were showing, that thousands of people would die from lack of health care, from that refusal to accept the Medicaid expansion. They knew that students' learning would be stunted by the cuts they were imposing on the schools. But they believed their endgame was worth the price. They were, you could say, again, in cold calculation, letting the chips fall where they may. And what my fellow critics of all this also could not see, and I understand that, I'll get to that, was that this agenda was backed by an ethical system that gave these actors confidence and even let them feel heroic enough to weather the criticism and opposition they were facing. I understand why people had trouble recognizing it as an ethical system, because it is foreign to most of us. In fact, it runs counter to all of the best of the world's major religious traditions. But it is an ethical system, and it has its own stark coherence that we need to understand if we are going to know how to deal with the crisis that the combination of Buchanan's ideas and Koch's money have created. To make this very plain, the libertarian morality deems it better to have people die from lack of health care than to receive it from government, from taxes paid for by others. This really is ultimately what they mean when they talk about personal responsibility. You should be on your own. And you should be on your own, not just for your health care, but for all your needs. You should, in their dream world, have private savings accounts for anything that you or your family might someday need, whether it's the education of your children, because that will no longer be public and taxpayers won't be contributing to it, you will, for your possible unemployment, for your retirement, for all of your needs. And also, and there's a hard edge to this moral system, if you fail to save for your future needs, you deserve your fate. Now, I don't know how they think people can save for things like breast cancer. I've had 6 women, friends, and family members in my life who have had breast cancer, and there's no way that you save for catastrophic illness like that. But these guys believe this. they believe you should be saving for yourself, and that was why they were so determined to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Because what they seek is a world in which we are kept from collectively using government to help ourselves and one another by these new ironclad rules. I learned all of this and more in 2013 when James Buchanan died. And finally that September, I got access to his private archive at George Mason University. And in his records, going back to the 1950s, I found my developing understanding of all of this confirmed in a way that, quite frankly, took my breath away many times. I'll give you just one example. In his private office on the second floor, I found a pile of documents stacked helter-skelter on a chair. And in that pile was a series of documents that exposed how Charles Koch and some of his top trusted operatives and George Mason University economics faculty and the provost and the president and the board of visitors of this public university had collaborated to establish a base camp for this political project just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. This was in 1997, when Koch gave his first $10 million gift to George Mason to support a big new center for political economy, what is today called the Mercatus Center. Koch made it clear in the speech that accompanied his gift that he wanted bold steps to come from his investment. He made clear that Buchanan's theory and implementation strategies were the right technology, to use Koch's favorite phrase, but the professor's team hadn't employed the tools forcefully enough to create what Koch called winning strategies. The operatives that Koch placed on the campus would. One of them was Buchanan's former colleague, the aptly named Richie Fink, who by that point had become Charles Koch's chief political advisor. Richie Fink made clear that barging into the nation's higher education system, by any means necessary, was crucial because, he explained, and I quote, "It's an integrated strategy that uses universities, think tanks, and political spending for the implementation of policy change. So the universities are part and parcel of the dark money spending to transform our system." With a respectable base camp secured for that strategy at George Mason, minutes from the Capitol, Koch would turn to assembling what he said he wanted when he gave that first multi-million-dollar gift, with the proclamation that, and I quote, "I want to unleash the kind of force that propelled Columbus to his discoveries." He's also compared himself to Martin Luther, suggesting that what he is doing will be the equivalent of the Protestant Reformation in its world-transforming impact. So to make the remainder of the story short, we've all felt that force that he wanted to unleash in the years since. It is a force that didn't start with President Obama's election, much as it gained power from white supremacist reaction to that, and it is a force that will not stop with the end of the Trump administration, however that happens. For now, though, in closing, let me pull the lens back from the campus outpost to the overall Koch project of political and social transformation. Because when I brought home the countless documents I had copied at Buchanan House and put them together with the other sources I had accumulated over the previous decade, I found myself laying down pieces of a puzzle that truly astounded me in its scope and audacity. This is a project that now encompasses dozens of ostensibly separate national organizations, some of whose names will be familiar to you: the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, ALEC, the Federalist Society, which, lo and behold, Charles Koch provided the seed money for, and now it's vetting all Republican judges. And if you add to the national organizations the state-level operations that make up something called the State Policy Network, like your own Rio Grande Foundation, And if you add in the international affiliates of the Atlas Network with operations in over 90 countries, we're talking about hundreds of organizations, well-funded, working to radically alter government and society, to bring unfettered free-rein capitalism into being without being honest with the people. And that is the single most important finding of my book, is that these guys say over and over again in their own words that they're doing what they're doing in the way they're doing it by stealth because they understand that the majority would never support this. People do not want to live in the society that they want to create. And as a historian, I also came to realize something else, and now we're circling back to where we started. The form of government these men see as ideal liberty, as the free society of their dreams, would be a lot like mid-century Virginia, in all but the state-forced racial segregation. When James Buchanan set to work in Charlottesville in 1956 with an avowed mission to preserve liberty, that state had just been identified by a brilliant political scientist, V.O. Key, as the most oligarchical state in the South and therefore in the nation. V.O. Key had kind of a dark sense of humor, and to make his point, he said that next to Virginia, Mississippi is a hotbed of democracy. Think about it yourself in light of what I've said here tonight and what you yourselves have observed over the last decade or so now. What is the substance of the libertarian notion of liberty but mid-century Virginia? A state that had formally representative government, but in fact was subjected to what V.O. Key called the most thorough control by an oligarchy. As I said, the state-mandated racial oppression would go, should they get their way in the future. But we need to recognize that nearly everything else about the political economy of mid-century Virginia enacts the dream of these people. Just a few examples before I close. The use of right-to-work laws and other ploys to keep working people powerless. The suspicion of public education as a costly and frivolous source of subversion. The regressive tax system and use of a pay-as-you-go budgeting system to rule out forward-looking investments for future generations. The insistence that government should not be allowed to act to stop discrimination by employers or others. The deployment of states' rights legal arguments to prevent the federal government from promoting equal treatment. The opposition to Social Security and Medicare and the Wagner Act that gave workers collective bargaining rights. All of those were led in Congress by Virginians. The miserly response to public needs of all kinds, from decent schools to public health and more. And of course, voting rights restrictions to keep those unlikely to support this system from the polls. In short, what Virginia had was rules that in combination ensured the uncontested sway of corporations and the wealthiest citizens. And the question this stealth plan presents us with, once we know it, is at one level quite simple. Is what this cause seeks the kind of world that we want to live in? The kind of world that we want to bequeath to our children and to future generations? That is the real public choice. Thank you.